2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
And is Malcolm Turnbull trying to walk both sides of the street? That's the question I'm asking this morning. Dr. Jim Joes, Associate Professor at the University of Newcastle, joins us for our regular political chat. Morning, Jim.
Good morning, Meryl.
Do you think I'm far off the money? It seems as though Malcolm Turnbull, our Prime Minister, has found himself in Paris and he has signed up to be part of this new innovation in climate change. But is he trying to walk both sides of the street, do you think?
Well, the short answer, I guess, is yes. But you have to, I think, understand that when Prime Ministers are abroad, when they're participating on the world stage, they're speaking to a different audience to some extent. And while they're also speaking to a domestic audience at a distance, they're largely speaking to the sort of international audience, as it were.
What's the message he's given?
Well, basically that he's on side with the world's most powerful individual, which is the President of the US, and Barack Obama is making a reasonably concerted push to do something about environmental issues and the way in which our actions as humans affects global climate. And so he's wanting to make a mark, and Malcolm Turnbull is signing up to that agenda, which is consistent with the Malcolm Turnbull of old to some extent. However, he's no longer operating in the sort of political environment that he was operating in when he was deposed as leader of the opposition. Now he's back as leader of the government and as Prime Minister, but his support depends upon a motley crew of alliances, particularly with some fairly conservative and in the past at least, people who were very vocal about the science underlying the sort of the climate change analysis, and hence adopted a sort of policy approach which seemed to be doing not much at all, which they called direct action, but which meant that they didn't have to sign up then to solutions which relied on scientific analysis. So they could sort of dismiss the science and claim they had an active policy involved. Now, Malcolm Turnbull has not dismissed that entirely. He hasn't said, look, let's get rid of direct action. Here's a better way to go. He's basically taking a very careful and perhaps measured approach in which he doesn't dismiss any particular way of solving the problem. And in fact, I think he said something along the lines that there are many ways to solve the problem and we shouldn't rule any out.
Yeah, I think he actually also said it doesn't matter how you reduce greenhouse gas emissions as long as you do it. I heard him say that directly. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And he was referring to direct action and Greg Hunt's policies. And I thought, this is really interesting. He's sounding far more pragmatic about it.
Yes, and Greg Hunt was a minister in the former Abbott government and was very vocal in the way in which he dismissed the sort of concerns of climate change activists and so forth. And Malcolm Turnbull is very much aware of that, and he's not wanting to alienate people too dramatically within his own party and within the coalition. So he's not signing up to the communique, or at least as we understand, he's not signing up to the Paris communique on phasing out fossil fuels and our reliance on fossil fuels, even though part of the solution will inevitably move us in that direction. He's signalling back to his constituency, to his, well, more so to his party allies and people who are holding him in place, that he's not going to take radical action to get rid of the reliance on fossil fuels. In particular, the consequence of that would be phasing out, for example, the diesel fuel rebate, which is largely beneficial to key supporters of the National Party. So he's, on the one hand, sort of signalling back that, there's no radical changes under my Prime Ministership. On the other hand, he's also pointing out that we will have to make some changes, but he's walking slowly so that his domestic control, shall we say, is not too dramatically threatened. So I would expect to see some shift in Malcolm Turnbull's approach once he takes his coalition to the next election, and on all indicators at present he would look like he's going to win. In particular, if he keeps making positive noises about wanting to do something about combating climate, the issues surrounding climate change, a vast majority of the Australian population recognise that this is an issue and the government needs to be doing more. And he's already announced $1 billion worth of support in foreign aid for principally Pacific Island communities and nations. He's also announced that much more research funding will be available to find solutions. So this is a positive step, series of positive steps. They're a move away from where the previous coalition government was at. They'd reduced a whole lot of support for research into renewables and so on. So Malcolm Turnbull's actually affecting a shift in which the majority of his party is not going to be unhappy about it.
Yes, he's doing it carefully. Now, just in closing, I just wanted your thoughts on this, Jim. I thought it was rather interesting that Barack Obama and Bill Gates and people like Richard Branson, people like Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, people like China's Alibaba Group chairman Jack Ma are talking about pooling their money to come up with new innovation and solutions. So we're actually seeing some of the big, wealthy, new corporate players getting involved in the innovation and potentially the policy of climate change as well. So not just leaving it up to governments in Paris, but also bringing some of these highly innovative companies and individuals, particularly like Richard Branson.
Yeah, well, despite the fact that Richard Branson's aviation interests depend on fossil fuels, he recognises, as do the others that you've mentioned, they're pretty well all of a generation that have were born and grew up in a period of growing environmental awareness and action on saving the environment and protecting the environment. So they have a shall we say, a worldview and an outlook that is not rooted in a early 20th century industrialised mentality. It's actually in a much different outlook, even though they probably, have a fairly solid carbon footprint themselves. They recognise the need to shrink that footprint and the need to do something more positive. So investing some of their earnings in that sort of research is a great step forward, and for researchers and universities and institutes of research, this will be a really good thing, and perhaps that will help governments around the world, in particular the Australian government, to invest more in renewable energy and ways in which we can wean ourselves off the fossil fuels that are part of the problem.
Dr. Jim Joes, Associate Professor in Politics, University of Newcastle. Thanks for your time, Jim, and we'll catch up with you next Tuesday.
My pleasure, Meryl.